heart strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee.
Chapter 1. The opening just kind of recounts the core of who the sons of Israel were who entered into entered into Egypt. Chapter 1, verse 6 records Joseph's death and then his brothers. Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. It says in verse 7, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. And I think that's the last thing I actually remember discussing, because that generally causes alarm to the indigenous people of a nation when there are foreigners among them who are prospering and who are growing and who are getting wealthy and gaining in power and influence. It makes people nervous. And that is exactly what happened here. And it says, a king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This verse is exactly what James is talking about when he says that your life is but a vapor. It appears for a little while and then vanishes away. We're actually going to read in just a moment, I think something that gets read over sometimes. The effects of Joseph's presence in Egypt continue to be felt, but they forget all about Joseph. And so just because you do something great and even have an impact on society doesn't even guarantee that you're going to be remembered. And that's exactly what happens here. He dies and the next generation comes up, and the next generation of Egyptians don't even know Joseph. The new king arose over Egypt, verse 8, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Now, I'm not real sure that they were more or mightier than them, but they were big enough to take notice of. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, they also join themselves to those who hate us, to fight against us and depart from the land. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Obviously, we don't have the whole history recorded here. Can we all agree on that? All right, so with that understanding, is there anything in what we are told about their time in Egypt in the end of the book of Genesis, or in the very brief things that were told here in the opening of this book, that would lend anyone to believe that they are going to become antagonists to the Egyptians? Would they have any reason to become antagonists to the Egyptians? So why would he be afraid and say, hey, let's deal wisely with them, lest a war comes along, which, by the way, as far as I know, there wasn't any wars happening, unless a war comes along and they join themselves to our enemies and fight against us. It does show that they didn't completely assimilate. You're absolutely right. And by the way, that creates problems. That's at the crux of the problem today in the nation of Israel. Is there's a large population of people in there that will never assimilate with Israel, and it will always create problems as they ultimately both make claim to the same land. But what is going on here seems to be what is common to human leadership, which is scare tactics. The justification for doing something to Israel is, well, they might side with our enemies if there ever is a war. So we need to do something about this now. They appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. They built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses. All right, that right there, verse 11, has a piece of information in it that I think we don't notice very often. It struck me in my reading, preparing for this class. I'm not sure I ever noticed it before. These two cities that it says that they had them build, what kind of cities were they? Storage cities. Had Egypt ever had storage cities before Joseph came along? In fact, whose idea was it? Well, it was Joseph's, it was God's through Joseph. So what they're doing here is carrying on the things that he did as a leader in Egypt, recognizing the value of having cities dedicated to storing the things that they needed in case there was a problem. But they've forgotten the one who gave them the idea to begin with. What does that tell us about life?
People are only focused on the here and now more than past or even the future.
That only what is before us seems significant and important to us. That we have no appreciation. And ultimately, they're not just forgetting Joseph, but they're forgetting Joseph's God, who he constantly, at least told Pharaoh. I don't know about if the rank and file in the nation knew it or not, but he constantly told Pharaoh, it's God that's going to give a response to your dream. It's God who's going to do these things. And so it wasn't that Pharaoh, now that becomes an important part of this story later. The fact that they have forgotten Joseph's God becomes a very important factor.
Why they were so prone and so fast to make an idol when Moses went up Mount Sinai, because they had been exposed to a lot of idolatry in Egypt.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a lot of detail, I think, when we get there in just a little while. I don't know if it'll be tonight or if it'll be next week that we get to that part of the story. Well, probably be a couple of weeks down the road, to be fair, because we still got the whole Moses story to get through. So anyway, there's no recollection that his imprint is still on the nation, but they have forgotten who the credit goes to. It reminds me of, honestly, myself as a child and other children that I've been around. When you ask them, where did you learn that? And they go, I just know it. Well, no, you can't just know that. Someone taught you that. Who taught it to you? Well, no one. I just know it. What have they done? They've forgotten who or where they learned it. That's what's going on here. Okay, the imprint of Joseph is there, but they have forgotten where they learned it. That happens in religion as well, where practices are engaged in, but nobody knows why. And if you say, why do you do that? They go, that's what we've always done. And you even hear those arguments sometimes when there's debates about whether things ought to be done or not. People level that as an argument. Well, it's the way we've always done it. Is that a legitimate theological argument? No. And yet, that's what happens, and that's what's going on here. So they have picked up and they've learned some things from God, but they don't even know that they've learned it from God. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. And so actually their plan wasn't too smart, because it actually had the opposite impact. By the way, this is the exact same thing that happened when they tried to destroy the church in the early days. The more they oppressed Christians, the more they spread out and the more they grew. And it had the exact opposite effect that they had hoped it would have. Maybe there's a pattern there we can learn from. Maybe the way to answer problems is to actually address problems rather than try to do what? Dominate and control. That's what they're trying to do here, is just enforce their will. And I would suggest that there's a high probability that the reason that they continued to prosper and continued to spread was because God was with them. Which also comes up important in the story, because they kind of end up forgetting about that themselves. So anyway, the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel, verse 13, to labor rigorously. They made their lives bitter with hard labor, mortar and bricks, and all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors which they rigorously opposed on them. I mean, we got just good old-fashioned slavery here. Giving them all the jobs that needed to be done, but that they didn't want to do themselves. Making them do the things that would make their society prosper on the backs of people that they were not giving proper compensation to. We'll say it like that. I'm not going to say they didn't give them any compensation, because when they get off in the wilderness later, they remember the good food that they had back in Egypt. Now, of course, that could be rose-tinted glasses as well, but the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Verse 15 says, now this is the next stage, okay? What the plan's not working. We're putting more and more pressure on them. They continue to prosper anyway. So he goes to the midwives and he says, when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth, verse 16, and see them upon the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall put him to death. But if it's a daughter, then he shall live. What are they effectively doing there? This is ethnic cleansing. If you get rid of the males, then there's not going to be any more Hebrews that are born. And there's not going to be anyone that grows up to be a soldier. And there's not going to be anyone to take over. And all that can happen is for then the Hebrew women to have children of the Egyptian men, which then makes little Egyptian children. So that's okay. So that's what the order was, and that's the thinking. It's exactly, and by the way, for the same reason. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. Now, verse 17 is very important, because the only justification that is ever given in Scripture for disregarding the ruling authorities, no matter who they are, or no matter how bad they've been, is what? To fear God and obey Him. It's the only reason ever proffered. And in fact, when Jesus was confronted at a time when the Romans were less than friendly to the Hebrews, he continually said to people what? Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So we have to understand this is not open rebellion. This is midwives going, you know what? That wouldn't be right. It's not right to murder a child. And we have to stand before God. And so they refused to do what they've been told. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing? And let the boys live. Verse 19 is a little bit difficult. The midwife said, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and they give birth before the midwife can get to them. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know if that was an excuse. Well, you know what? Because we're not there. By the time we get there, the child's already born and we don't even know whether it's a boy or a girl. There's no need for us. I don't know. I have a hard time believing that because there wouldn't be any point in having Hebrew midwives if they weren't helping deliver babies. But anyway, but it says, so God was good to the midwives. That is a reflection of the fact that they feared God, not that they misled. God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. And it came about because the midwives feared God that he established households for them. Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you're to keep alive. So then he just basically tells all. He doesn't try to do it privately anymore. He makes an edict and says to the Hebrews, if you have a boy, throw him into the river. You're not allowed to let your boys live. I really don't know how many Hebrew boys got thrown into the Nile. Yes.
So Pharaoh commanded all his people, the Egyptians.
That is a good question. It's a very good question. It certainly can be read that way. And I think that is the general idea of an edict from the king, which would mean that all the subjects would be required. And so we're going to see later on in the story that there clearly is issues between the Egyptians and the Hebrews and the way that they interact with each other and treat one another, which arise from such things. If the government says, hey, everyone, the Hebrew boys need to be thrown into the Nile, what does that say to people? Okay. It dehumanizes Hebrew people. That's what it does. And if I can develop the mindset of them not having any value, then it's going to come out in everything that I do and say toward them, which is going to play into this story a little bit as well, because when Moses flees and goes into the wilderness, why does he do that? He kills an Egyptian man. What was that Egyptian man doing? Beating a Hebrew, which indicates that they didn't have any respect for the Hebrews. They didn't see them as human. They dehumanized them. And this is where it starts. By the way, I believe that abortion has the same exact effect on people today. That if we get to the point that we don't see anything wrong with that, we dehumanize babies. And nothing good can come from that. It will only cause us to have less and less respect for human life, which gives rise to what? More crime, more theft, more murder, more abuse. And if all other human life is of no value, then eventually people start thinking what? They themselves are of no value, of no special value, which gives rise to what? I just live any way I want to, do anything I want to do. I'm just going to die one day and then it's going to be over and I don't have any value anyway. And that's just not a good scenario. Instead, God continually reminds us of the value of humanity, that we're created in the image of God. And to make that point even stronger, and this is an issue that a lot of people struggle with, but to make that point even stronger, and we just read it, well, it's been a while ago because it's back in Genesis 9, but at the end of the flood, he says that if a human wantonly takes another human's life, what is to be done? His life is to be taken. Why? What's the reasoning behind that? Yep, good. Human life is of such great value. And the interesting thing is, I think sometimes we miss even the reason why that was necessary to put in there. You realize that the reason that becomes necessary to actually codify and make that statement part of the covenant, you cannot take human life, is because he has just said, you can take all animal life. I give you everything for food, as I gave you the green plant. And so the minute you start killing animals, there's the fear of what? Of devaluing the people around you. And so he said, but there's a line that's drawn. Humans are not part of this. And if you take a human life without cause, then my judgment is that man should put him to death, so that you might know that there is value to life. And so when you get a society that dehumanizes people by allowing wanton killing for no good reason, and then turns around and further devalues human life by saying that if someone kills a human, then nothing should happen to him all that bad, then it just gets worse and worse. And we have to be aware of that. That's part of this story. So Pharaoh commanded them. I'm going to go with all his people means just that. Everybody under his control. That the order goes, if you see a Hebrew baby boy, it goes into the Nile. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket, covered it over with tar and pitch. She put the child into it, set it among the reeds of the bank of the Nile. So she waited 3 months, but she did in fact put her son in the Nile. In a boat. The ark, which is a picture of our salvation. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." And so the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take the child away and nurse him for me, and I shall give you your wages." Now, there's a lot of interesting things coming up here. So now Moses' mom is going to be paid to raise Moses. Instead of the child dying, Pharaoh's daughter has pity on the child. Why would Pharaoh's daughter have pity on the child? Why might she be nice where somebody else would not be nice? She's insulated from this edict. She's not among those people who are dehumanizing. So when she sees the baby, she sees what? A little baby that's crying and has pity on the child. And boy, the irony is so thick, because the one Hebrew boy that's going to be saved by Pharaoh's house is the one Hebrew boy that's going to grow up to be the one that undoes Pharaoh. I hope that you can. Just the irony is thick. The child grew, verse 10 says, and she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Do we know how old he was? Older. I'm going to say past weaning, because the whole point of going to the Hebrew woman was to nurse the child. I don't know for sure how long Moses was raised by his mother, but it was years. I'm thinking that he was probably a young lad when he goes to live in Pharaoh's house. She named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And so Pharaoh's daughter is actually the one who named him Moses. It came about in those days when Moses had grown up. So we just jumped like 40 years, or not quite, almost, because he's about 40 years old when these things happen. So we jumped, I'm going to go with somewhere between 35 and 37 years in one verse. Moses had grown up, he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. I'm going to stop here for just a moment. I want us to think about this as well, because Moses was raised by his mother long enough to know his identity and to know something about God and some other things, and that becomes clear as you read the story. Can you imagine what life was like for Moses, being the one Hebrew in all the land who lived in Pharaoh's household and was treated with respect and fed and taken care of, while all the rest of his people were being abused? We're not told that information, are we?
Because it's just one of those things. Thinking about what was like Moses, it could really depend on a lot of those sorts of things. Because if Pharaoh knew and disapproved, it could
Right.
be tough. But if they didn't know, maybe it was hard for Moses.
Yeah, and
Maybe she looked on different part of the past.
and the movies don't help us, by the way. The movies don't help us because they fill in all those blanks and make it really dramatic and soap opera-like. And DeMille's movie had him as like the Pharaoh in waiting, and then his brother Ramesses was jealous of him. And that's somewhere in between verse 10 and 11. It ain't in the Bible. But his life had to be, we'll go with interesting. Yeah. Challenging. And that informs us a little bit about this incident that we're fixing to read. He looked this way and that. So he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looks this way and that. And when he saw there was no one around, so he thought, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. So he murdered someone and buried him in a shallow grave. Now, this is important too. I actually have a sermon somewhere, unless it got lost to the ether when my computer crashed. But I actually have a sermon somewhere where I talk about the fact that God used a murderer to save his people. Because that's what he did here. We don't have the authority to kill someone simply because. But that's what he did. Now, what might explain is when you consider the fact that the things that we just talked about. He knew who he was. He knew he was also a Hebrew. He had seen this his whole life. He's now 40 years old. He's been isolated and protected as a member of Pharaoh's household. And he finally says, you know what? It's enough of this. This is just not right. And he snaps. He went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, why are you striking your companion? So this is just another layer. So he had just killed an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew person, and then he goes out and there are two Hebrews fighting. And he's like, why are you hitting him? Who made you a prince or judge over us? Well, there's some more irony there, because guess what? God would make him a prince and a judge over them. Might have applied certainly would have given him authority over them at the time.
Moses was a little impulsive in the sense that this is murder, and then later, instead of talking to the rock, he strikes the rock. He's got this sort of impulsive, maybe aggressive.
He has a temper. Or he has not enough of a temper is actually the way to say that. Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? See, apparently when he looked around for other Egyptians who could have got him in trouble. He wasn't really necessarily looking around for other Hebrews. So they knew what had happened. They saw him. You're going to kill me like you did the Egyptian. And Moses was afraid at that point and said, surely the matter has become known. Okay, they're talking about it. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled down in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So our picture into the early life of Moses only involves two events. One where he's a tiny baby and 3 months old, doesn't do anything. And the other as a 40-year-old man, and he murders somebody, and then he runs away from Egypt to save his life. That becomes important because in chapter 4, I think it is, when God is trying to send him back to Egypt, he is hesitant to go. This is why he's hesitant to go. Even though it's been 40 years, his assumption is what? Yeah, there's still a picture of me in the post office. And if I go back down it, I'm just going to be killed. So that explains his hesitancy more than him just being hesitant to obey God. And there's something to talk about in that when we get there as well, because at some point we have to realize that the service to God, even if it means our death, is something that we shouldn't shy away from. That's what we see later in the story of Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and other people who facing death, Stephen, Peter and John at one point, Paul, if I've done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. All of these people come to the point where the obedience to God is more important than the preservation of life. At the stage of Moses' life in chapter 4, he's not quite there yet. I think he does get there, but he's not quite there yet. By the way, Moses' life basically is presented to us in 3 different blocks. They're all 40 years. The first 40 years, the middle 40 years, the last 40 years. And at 120 years old, God takes his life. And he was just as strong then as he had ever been. All right. I got to stop. The clock says it's time to stop. And so we'll pick up, if the Lord wills. What verse was that? Verse 16? Yeah, I finished verse 15. So we'll pick up in verse 16.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea.